Marking the end of combat operations in Afghanistan, US and British troops hand over their sprawling desert bases. But as one front closes, others are opening, begging the question, is the war on terror a battle that can ever be won? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. It was a conflict that began in October 2001. US and British forces dispatched to Afghanistan less than a month after the September 11th attacks on New York's World Trade Center. The beginning of then US President George Bush's so-called war on terror, the supposed aim at that time to defeat the Taliban, deprive Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda a safe haven, and to cut opium production, employing a military strategy. Well, 13 years on, the campaign in Afghanistan is drawing to a close, but the war on terror is still being waged. So what is the underlying justification, the rationale behind the military campaigns? And is it a fight that can never be won? Well, to our discussion in a moment. But first, Jennifer Glass in Kandahar reports on the uncertain legacy of the campaign in Afghanistan.
The lowering of flags marks the end of a 13-year combat mission in Afghanistan. British forces and U.S. Marines handed over their last bases in Helmand Province to Afghans. Operation Enduring Freedom effectively began in October 2001. There were once more than 30,000 foreign soldiers on these bases alone. NATO's combat mission is over at the end of the year, and most of the troops are going home. The British Defense Secretary says they've achieved their mission.
There is a better chance of a more stable future in Afghanistan because we have a government there of national unity and an army that is supported by the local population that represents all parts of Afghanistan.
But Afghan forces suffered heavy losses this year in battles with the Taliban. And over the years, thousands of coalition troops and civilians have been killed or injured. The head of the British forces admits the security situation remains difficult. And that's one of the reasons why some 12,000 NATO forces will remain in Afghanistan until 2016 to support the Afghan forces. But their role will be vastly different than in the past. They will train, advise, and assist the 350,000 Afghan security forces. For Britain and the U.S. Marines, the handover means their war in Afghanistan is over. Jennifer Glass, Al Jazeera, Kandahar.
Well, let's bring in our guest now into the discussion. Joining us from London is Afzal Ashraf, a security analyst and consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. In Washington, D.C., we have Phyllis Bennis, a director at the Institute for Policy Studies and author of the book Ending the Iraq War, a Primer. And completing our panel in London is Davis Lewin, Deputy Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Good to have you with us. If I could start with Davis, is there a finish line in this so-called war on terror?
Well, I think that there is a question to be had about how exactly we define victory and whatever else in that sense. I think that the reality is that there is a pernicious ideology that threatens not just us in the West, but also the people in the Middle East that are living under the yoke of it, where it is being imposed in that sense. And the finishing line really would be to be free from coercion to live under this kind of ideology in the first instance. And we can then have a debate about what kind of a society is desirable or not, but we can all be clear that the kind of thing that we're seeing in those regions where we are fighting what used to be called the war on terror, that definitely defeating that kind of government, defeating that kind of a situation.
Okay, hang on, Davis. You used a lot of really interesting terms there. People living under that sort of government, that sort of ideology. What ideology are we talking about? What is the target of the, and governments are we talking about? Are we talking about oppressive dictatorships that are backed by the West? Are we talking about oppressive dictatorships that are not backed by the West? I mean, are we talking about groups that don't operate as non-state actors?
Well, I think in the first instance, when we speak of the war on terror, of course, this is linked to radical Islamist governments such as Islamic State that we're seeing in Syria and Iraq at the moment. And as I say, we can then have a conversation about various other forms of government and whatever else how we feel about this. Personally, of course, I'm of the view that democracy is most certainly a universally desired form of government, and there are many, many different arguments about how and what one should do to support it. But in the first instance, if we are talking about the war on terror, of course we are talking about the kind of Islamists such as Osama bin Laden was, the Al-Qaeda-style, ISIS-style kind of radical Islam, and those that support it, might I say as well, those that fail to be a part of whatever coalition there might be to destroy such an occurrence wherever such a government pops up. That can be a non-state actor. It can at times also be a state actor. We've seen some of the controversies over the visit of the Emir of Qatar to London just recently, and I think that there is a debate to be had about what the role, in particular, of other countries in the region is in that sense. But in the first instance, it clearly does refer to these kind of radical Islamist instituted governments where they appear, and making sure that that ideology doesn't have the opportunity to spread in the way that Islamic State has now managed to combine this atrocious violence and territory the size of the state that it now controls, and that of course has to be rolled back in what I would argue is a very obvious front for this particular war.
All right, Phyllis Bennis, is the finish line here, shall we say, developing? I'm looking back to statements made, for example, by then US President George Bush in 2003, where he said, in the Battle of Afghanistan, we destroyed the Taliban. You know, the initial object and goal seemed to be the removal of the Taliban from power. And even in 2004, he went on to say, as a result of the United States military, the Taliban is no longer in existence. Now we're talking about ISIL, we're talking about a bunch of other groups, countries. You know, is what defines the finish line here mushrooming out of control?
I think there never was a military finish line. The idea that you could suppress terrorism through war, I think never made any sense, and it doesn't make any sense now. The groups that we're looking at, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whose roots are in the anti-Soviet insurgency in Afghanistan, or the ISIS, whose roots are in opposition to the US occupation of Iraq, these are organizations extreme, violent, horrific for the people where they live, no doubt. But they are organizations that are rooted in opposition to Western intervention, Western occupation in their countries. And the notion that that can somehow be bombed out of existence simply isn't the case. It hasn't been true anywhere. You know, there's an old saying in China that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. The same thing is true for diplomacy, for the whole range of non-military actions that have been absolutely excluded, not officially, and officially we're doing all those things, but in the real world, what we're doing is dropping bombs, airstrikes, dropping weapons. We are re-weaponizing these forces, knowing that the weapons will end up in the hands of ISIS.
But then, Phyllis, forgive me for interrupting you too, but Phyllis, how do you respond to the supporters of military action who would make the argument and say, well, what is the alternative when you have groups that are targeting minorities, when beheading civilians and journalists? What are you going to do if you don't like dropping bombs?
Well, first of all, we should be clear that things as horrific as beheadings go far beyond ISIS. The Free Syrian Army was held responsible for 6 beheadings right in the middle of August, when we were first hearing about the need for a military assault on ISIS. So these horrific actions are far more widespread, and we only seem to be responding when the victims are from the West. You know, what led to a complete reversal of public opinion in the United States, which had been overwhelmingly against any intervention in Syria, what began to turn that around was not the significant number of beheadings of local people, the violence against local people, but the fact that 2 Western journalists were horrifically killed. A horrific act. But did going to war against ISIS make that any better? No, it did not. And I think that what we're looking at is a mix of a kind of desperation that says, all we can do is military because that's all we have left. We have so militarized our foreign policy that even our diplomacy has become militarized. If we look at Afghanistan, where the troops are being withdrawn today from the last bases are being pulled out from the poppy growing, opium producing areas of Afghanistan, there is more opium being produced now than there was before. So, this notion that somehow a military response is going to answer the challenges of these kinds of violent extremism is simply not the case. We have to look at root causes.
All right, let's bring in Afzal, because you spend time, of course, studying this issue and this question. Is the military approach, if we can call that, is the military approach working when Brigadier General Daniel Yu, the commander of the regional command, is quoted October the 22nd, 2014, as saying, "I'm cautiously optimistic they will," referring to the Afghan army, "they will be able to sustain themselves." If that's the best you can say after more than a decade of fighting, is hopefully the Afghan army won't be defeated by the Taliban, and you're cautiously optimistic rather than what George Bush was talking about of destroying them, you've got to wonder whether Phyllis has a point in saying you can't bomb your way out of this problem.
Well, I think that Phyllis's point is well made, and I don't think there are many military people who would believe that that is the case. Having studied these ideologies, there are really two things that sustain them. One is the grievances that they're fighting against, and these grievances are primarily two things. One is Western, or the perception of Western hegemony, Western oppression, Western involvement in their affairs. And the second factor is the ineffectiveness of governments in primarily Muslim countries, whether they're in the Middle East and elsewhere, to provide a legitimate and effective form of government. And it's these two factors that push extremism.
Well, how do you address those two factors, Afzal, without bombs or guns, or in addition to at least bombs and guns? I mean, how else would you address that?
Well, those two factors can't really be addressed through military means, and in fact military means can make those factors worse, and some of the examples have been given to you. But there is another factor which I want to highlight, and that is the concept of success. These organizations came into being because they believed they could succeed in changing the world order. Bin Laden and co. Developed these ideologies following their experience in Afghanistan, where they were under the impression that their actions, their jihadi war, led to the destruction of what they believed to be the world's greatest superpower. That gave them the confidence to take on the lesser superpower, the West, and so on. So the concept of success as well as the grievances are the two factors that sustain this organization. Now, the idea of success can and has successfully been targeted through military means. Military action can suppress, they cannot defeat, but they can suppress these movements, and they can help to break this myth of success. But in so doing, they can actually add to the grievances if they're not employed correctly. And in Afghanistan and Iraq, those military means weren't employed correctly because those forces were seen as occupation forces. Those forces conducted operations, some of which ended up targeting unintentionally civilians and causing a great deal of disruption and adding to the grievances that these organizations exploit.
What you're saying, actually, the Afzal seems to agree with research which has been presented by Robert Pape. He's a political scientist at the University of Chicago's Project on Security and Terrorism, and he's carried out extensive research on the causes of so-called terrorist attacks. Now, he found that 95% of all suicide attacks were in response to foreign occupation. He says that as the US occupied Afghanistan and Iraq, the number of suicide attacks around the world rose dramatically, and that the vast majority of those who carry out suicide attacks come from areas threatened by foreign troops. So perhaps the results there by researchers saying one size fits all doesn't work when it comes to a monopoly on the use of force and bombings. Davis, I wonder whether you would agree with the sort of points which Phyllis is making there, that you have to address the root causes of these conflicts, that to put it down to ideology, a radical ideology, doesn't really deal with the real issue that sends people to join some of these radical armed groups. You have to look at marginalization, occupation, dictatorship, all of these complex factors, and ask, how do we deal with that? Is that idealistic thinking, or is that in the right direction, do you think?
Well, it's in the right direction in that we have to explore this concept, but unfortunately Phyllis, Afzal and the professor that you quote start with the incorrect premises. This is not something to do with historical circumstance in Afghanistan, or that ISIL is some sort of emergent anti-American force that is active in the Middle East. That's preposterous as something to posit. This is something to do with the basis of an ideology, radical Islam, very clearly at the bottom of this. It is clearly discernible in the way that they claim to represent the religion, whether it's a perversion of religion or not. It is what they are claiming, and it is at the heart of it what is making it so effective. Let us not lose sight of the fact that the reason why, in this case, ISIS has been able to be as effective as it is because of the way that it uses the religious and theological justifications for what it is doing, and the appeal to its followers in that sense from the religious. Of course it's true. It would be inexplicable why anybody would say anything else, given how much at the core of what ISIL is doing is the theological element, and then it's coupled to a very capable execution of taking that theological call to arms and making it very modern, very palatable, very impressive. It adds a sense of adventure, it adds a sense of media savvy, and all these kinds of things. But at the bottom of it is a religious justification, a religious motivation that is extraordinarily powerful. And anybody that tries to explain this on the basis of structural factors such as foreign intervention, such as having seeded it in previous conflicts in the Cold War, or whatever else like that, is conducting a complete misreading of what is at the bottom of that.
Complete
and therefore
misreading.
will not
I
be
can
able
see Phyllis
Perhaps
wants
we
to
could
get
get a different reading.
Give us the alternative reading that perhaps Ms. Davis would call the misreading. Let's hear you out, Phyllis.
Well, I think there's two factors here. On the one hand, there is no question that organizationally, ISIS, which is only one of many jihadi organizations, it is the one that right now is emerging as both the strongest, taking territory, which is a different approach than many of the others, and more violent than many of the others. There's no question about that. But there is also no question that it emerged out of the organization that started in Iraq, known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that was designed and emerged specifically to fight against the U.S. occupation. Again, one of many. But the other aspect that I think is so important here is that when we look at why ISIS has been so successful, some of it, yes, has to do with the appeal of their version of Islam and the theological appeal, no doubt. That's hugely important. But also important is the fact that they have found local support. They have found local support from the Sunni tribal leaders who do not support their extremism, but support them despite that extremism because they see them as a better ally against the worst problem. Excuse me, let me finish, please.
The Sunni tribal leaders were butchered.
Excuse me, can I finish my sentence?
They were butchered.
Some of them were, yes,
Sunni
and others.
Tribal leaders were butchered by ISIS. It is completely incorrect.
Can I finish or not?
Okay, let Phyllis finish the sentence, Phyllis, and then we'll give Davis a chance.
They are getting support from both some of the Sunni tribal leaders who see them as a lesser evil than the government in Baghdad that has been responsible for killing, for bombing, for arresting. And they are getting support from the Sunni generals under Saddam Hussein's regime who are providing them with the military training and military capacity that has enabled them to make the kind of military
Phyllis,
gains
you made your point.
that
Davis,
they have made.
Davis, 30 seconds.
It is a very, very grim reality when we again have an analysis such as that, when the reality is that on the ground the Sunni leaders have just been butchered trying to rise up against ISIS. It's again preposterous to say that they enjoy that support. There are some discussion to be had about how ISIS emerged in relation to the government's partisan politics, but to say now that they enjoy that support is absolutely flatly incorrect.
Right, okay. I have an interesting quote here, again from Robert Pape from the University of Chicago, precisely on this point which we're arguing about. And he says, because the 9/11 hijackers were all Muslims, it was easy to presume that Islamic fundamentalism was the central motivating force driving the 19 hijackers. He goes on to say, new research provides strong evidence that suicide terrorism such as that of 9/11 is particularly sensitive to foreign military occupation and not Islamic fundamentalism. So, Davis, very briefly, you would argue that he's got it wrong.
Of course he's got it wrong. The will to live does not easily is not easily overcome. In order to overcome it, you have to have a system of belief and a system of theology that is, however misread and however perverted in terms of what it is genuinely supposed to be, that has given you this sense that this is what it is for.
Okay,
they are doing it.
We've just got a few minutes left
because they believe that they are doing it for Allah.
Let me bring in Afzal into the discussion. Once you go down that route, Afzal, you must start to ask the question of who is the radical that needs to be eliminated? I mean, we're at a stage now in the world as well, on the other side, in the West, where you have popular television show hosts like Bill Maher saying, quote, not only does the Muslim world have something in common with ISIS, it has too much in common with ISIS. He goes on to say in another clip, quote, once again, I have to say their religion, referring to Islam, is even worse. I mean, where does it end? We got the British Ministry of Education's report on radicalism in schools, referencing trips to Umrah, pilgrimage trips to Mecca as signs or evidence of radicalization. Once you go down the road of, is Islam the problem? Do you turn this into a war against Islam and all Muslims, that they're all ISIS?
Yes, this is a big problem here because people are very easily polarizing the debate. The situation is a lot more complex and nuanced than that. The motivations, when you study it, when you look at the evidence, as I've done, and I've looked at Al-Qaeda since 1998, it's very clear that it is primarily politically motivated. Its objectives are political. It has always adapted and compromised theology to achieve political objectives. But it's also equally true to say that in large parts of the Muslim world, there is what I would describe as a lack of theological hygiene. In other words, there are some bad ideas that have been allowed to come in to various interpretations which these organizations have exploited. Now, that does not mean that the religion of Islam is in any way bad. It's a very good religion, regardless of what right-wing extremists in parts of America and elsewhere would like to think, because this is a great opportunity.
Does the same problem not exist in other societies, Mr. Afzal, in other communities and religions, and even in the West, where you have a very extreme interpretations of their values and religion?
Indeed. And, I can talk to you at some great length about how extremism has come into Christianity and into Hinduism and into Judaism and elsewhere. And when you look at those examples, you see a very clear pattern. And that pattern is a response to political and social stresses, regardless of the religion. People adapt their religion to justify violence. They adapt their religion to mobilize people around an identity.
Right.
So it is preposterous, to use a term that's been used, to suggest that this is purely about religion, but it is important to accept that in wider Muslim society, it needs to accept that these ideas that have crept in, and they've crept in for reasons I can explain later, historical reasons, have to be shunned, have to be driven out. And lots of people are actually doing that.
Right, that later...
so it's a complex situation.
That later, unfortunately, will have to come later. We are out of time on this show. I apologise to our guests, but let's also thank them. Phyllis Bennis, Davis Lewin and Afzal Ashraf. And do please add your thoughts to the discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter @AJ Inside Story is where to find us. I'm Sami Zeidan. Thanks for watching. From me and all the team, it's goodbye for now.